5 characteristics of verbs. You have learned 4 of them. The first one is person, which we know is first, second, or third person. You know number, which just means singular or plural. Tense, which is, of course, present, perfect, imperfect, future, etc., right? Pluperfect. Mood, and there are 3 moods. The 2 you've learned are indicative and imperative. So we've got indicative and imperative. And the last thing you're going to learn about is voice. Now, voice tells us the relationship between the subject and the action. So basically, is the subject doing the action or is the subject receiving the action? So let's take a look at that. So you've known active so far. We're going to talk about passive. So an active sentence will say, Anna will paint the living room. The passive says, the living room will be painted by Anna. Active is the dragon scorched the village, and the village was scorched by the dragon. So hint here, 2 things make it passive. A lot of times you're going to see by Anna in here, or by something. It'll tell us who it's done by. So we see that the painting is done to the living room, to the subject. The verb scorched is done to the village. And another thing that I want to point out here, that in English they use always in passive helping verbs. Will be painted, was scorched. Now, those are the clues that'll help you know that it's passive. What about if there's no, here's a passive, these right here, under here, are also passive. So, Grant is offered a hot chocolate. Now, that's passive because Grant is not doing the offering. The subject is not doing the verb. Something is being done to the subject. Grant is offered a hot chocolate. Here as well, the balloon was popped. Now, the balloon didn't do the popping, right? The popping was done to the balloon, but it's passive. And one of the ways I tell my students to be able to get a hint that it's passive and not active when there's no by something, right? Or when there is that if you can add the words by zombies to the end of the sentence and it makes sense, then it's passive. So Grant is offered hot chocolate by zombies. Yes, that's passive. The balloon was popped by zombies. So if you can add by zombies to the end of a passive sentence that already doesn't have a by in it and it makes sense, then it's passive. Okay. So as we said, English distinguishes active and passive voices. They add a helping verb. Latin does not use a helping verb. So instead, I actually think it's easier. It's triggered by a set of passive personal endings. So you never have to guess whether something is passive or not. You just have to look at the verb and look at the ending. Okay. So let's take a look at this. You have in your verb charts, you have a series of passive verb endings. We're only going to add present passive today. Although you can see from this page and the next, there are endings for every tense that you've learned. So forming the present passive is almost the same as forming the active. You use the second principal part, which is also called the infinitive, and then you're going to add the passive endings to the end of the stem. So instead of OST, moose, tis, nt, you can kind of actually see there's a T there, there's a moose, Minnie's not so close, but there's an NT. So it's not so different from the regular present tense endings. You can see it a little bit. The only thing you need to remember is for first present passive singular, you're going to add the ending to the first principal part. Okay, I'll show you how this works. So let's conjugate a verb from each of the conjugations in the passive form. So first conjugation, present passive. If we're going to do inflow, inflari, inflavi, inflatum. So you see how we take the first principal part here and then we just add the R. And the rest of it, remember, we take off the RE. So we've got infla is the stem. And here we have ris, ter, mer, mini, inter. Pretty easy, and the rest of that is just the stem. So, and that makes passive. So instead of I am blown up, I am being blown up. Remember how we can add by zombies? And that helps us check that it's passive. Okay, second conjugation. RDOs. Take the same thing, to be on fire, to burn. Same thing, first principle part, and then we just add the ending to it. The rest of it, we find the stem, right? And then we add the normal ending, ris, ter, mer, mini, nter. Okay? 2 exceptions for third conjugation. The second person singular keeps the E instead of changing to an I. Remember that weak E usually changes to an I before adding the ris, and the third person plural changes the I to a U before adding the enter. Okay, so same thing here. We've got the mergo, first principal part, adding the O. We've got those 2 exceptions, but the rest is ris, ter, mer, mini, nter. And as far as the exceptions, you may want to take a quick moment and write those down somewhere in your chart book so that you remember how to do that. All right, so if we're going to do IO, conjugation present passive, so yakio, yakieri, yaki, yaktum, totally normal again. First principal part, this is mal present, remember, and then we've got the r, ris, ter, mer, mini, nter. Again, we have the E here, and we have the U. So that's the same. It's the same for both. The same rule goes for both third conjugations. Okay, fourth conjugation, present passive. The only weird thing is it adds a U before adding the enter. Reveni, unter. So you don't replace it. You add an extra. You add an extra U. So you might want to make a note of that. Revenio. Remember R, ris, ter. Everything else stays the same with the I. Mer, mini, extra U, enter. Pretty easy. It's just going to take some getting used to writing it down and remember those funny little exceptions. Okay, so this is present passive. It's the only tense you're going to learn today, but let's talk about the present passive infinitive. One more thing to learn today, and it's pretty simple to form. So you already know that the infinitive, which is the second principal part, on its own simply translates as to verb. You've been doing a lot of that since Latin 1. Now there is a passive form of infinitives as well. So that literally, the infinitive is the active infinitive. We don't call it the active infinitive all the time, but that's what it is. It's the active. It does have a passive form, and in its passive form it translates to be verbed. And if you remember, we can say to be verbed, to be anything, to be chased by zombies, and that's how we know it is passive. So if you take a look at these conjugations, this chart is actually in your chart book. You can see it on the infinitive page. Active is simply the first, second principal part. And we have all the normal endings that you come to expect. A-R-E, E, strong E, weak E for third and third I-O, and then an I-R-E for fourth. I'm going to leave S-A alone for a minute. I'll tell you why in just a second. Now, second principal part, to be verbed. Same principal part, except you're going to change the ending. You see how it's an I here? The A-R-E turns into A-R-I. And the E of second principal part, the strong E, changes to an I. So it becomes E-R-I. Now, third and third I-O, the entire E-R-E collapses and just becomes an I. So you're going to be missing. It's going to look weird. And so if you see a really short word that doesn't have an R in it, think about it, and it ends in an I. It removes the first E and R and takes the whole thing and just makes it an I. Fourth conjugation, the the I-R-E becomes an I-R-I. Here. And the reason essay I have here as active, it is, essay, remember, is an infinitive, but there's no passive form of essay because you cannot be to be'd. You can't be was'd by zombies or is'd by zombies or word by zombies. It doesn't work. So you cannot make the to be verb passive. All right, let's look at a couple of examples here. So present active. So we see all these endings just like you normally expect. Negare, to deny, becomes negari, to be denied. Again, be denied by zombies. Prohibere, to protect, becomes prohiberi, to be protected by zombies. Sternere, to strew, becomes sterni. Remember, it shortens to just the I. To be strewn by zombies. Not a pleasant sensation, I think, to be strewn by zombies. Capere, IO verb to capture becomes copy. So it significantly shortens. So don't let that throw you when you see it, right? Be keeping in your mind that it could be a passive infinitive. To be captured by zombies. That one's more appropriate, I think. And comparire, fourth conjugation, to find out, becomes an IRI, to be found out by zombies. So really what you're looking at is verbs that end in I. Do you notice that they all a single one of them end in I? Again, look for the pattern and let that be your clue that we might be talking about passive infinitives. Present passive infinitives form from the second principal part, except you see they either turn into an I or have an I at the end.